Welcome to today's episode of 20 Tactics, where we're going to be taking a look at some of the tactical options to get the most out of your magic phases as we discuss casting spells. Now, you're going to be led through today by me, James The Loremaster, and unlike our previous 20 Tactics videos, we're not going to have a table set up today because it doesn't really aid in the explanation of the tactics we're discussing. So you'll just have my voice today to lead you through the magic phase. Now, before we begin, I'm going to clear up a couple of things. For the avoidance of any confusion, we're only looking at some of the tactical options you can employ when casting spells in friendly magic phases. If you want to up your dispelling game, then head back to the Knight of the Realm mustering ground after you've watched this video and check out our 20 tactics on dispelling. Now, the second thing I'm going to clear up is simply grabbing 6 power dice and throwing them at a big spell every turn. Now, we've all seen it, and I know that some within the community get very upset about it. You get that player that just grabs 6 dice every magic phase, throws them at a big purple sun, a cacophonic choir, a dwellers below, so on. Now, I want to establish that this is not a tactic for playing the magic phase. Sure, grabbing 6 dice sometimes is a natural part of the game, but coming in with this as your game plan is not going to help you consistently win games of Warhammer. It might get you a win here or there, but with good counterplay from your opponent and smart army list building, for example multiple aggressive threat, so there's not that one big unit you can just smash up with a big spell, the worst effects of this tactic are sort of offset, if you like. And that's without us covering, what if you fail to cast it because you throw the dice, don't get there? What if you roll really low power dice on your magic phase? So we won't be defining this as a tactic for today's video, and it's not something that in general we would encourage as a competitive tactic for Warhammer. Now, with what might seem like a small rant over, the tactics we will cover today are broadly split into 2 categories. You have tactics that you can employ in any friendly magic phase, and tactics you need to build your army list around. Or rather, that you need to build into your army list is possibly a better way of putting it. Now, this is an important distinction, as the latter of these two is set up when you construct your army list, whereas the former is a consistent set of tactical choices that you can use in all of your games. So, today we're going to begin by looking at tactics that you can employ in any friendly magic phase, and there's 5 of them. So we've got playing the odds, drawing out enemy dispel dice, playing with redundancy, casting order, and knowing when to stop. So let's begin by looking at what we mean when we say playing the odds. So when we talk about that, what we mean is calculating the average number of dice you will need to use to successfully cast a spell. We do that by looking at what we will be adding to the casting total with our wizard, and then working out the average number of dice required after that. So to use a specific example, let's assume we have a high elf archmage, and that they're a level 4 wizard. Now if we put them onto high magic, and they look at casting Fiery Convocation. So we can see the casting total required for this spell is at 19 plus. So the archmage will add 4 to the dice score from its wizard level, and as it's a high magic wizard, it will get an additional 1 from its Liliath's Blessing, meaning that your starting requirement of a 19 plus, but we're going to knock 5 points off with our wizard level, leaving and buffs, leaving us 14 plus required on the dice. Now, the average score on 4 dice is 14, so we know that we can expect to successfully cast this spell on 4 dice. However, when we talk about playing the odds, what we're actually saying is using the number of dice you expect to need to guarantee a successful casting roll. So we would realistically want to throw 5 dice at this spell to make some space for, falling just a bit short of the average. Now, this is so important because we don't want to use more dice than we require when casting spells, as this gives us a chance to cast more spells later in the phase, and helps us to sort of prevent miscasting and taking those nasty effects. We also don't want to fail to cast either, breaking concentration and losing that wizard for the remainder of that magic phase. So, this is particularly disastrous if it's the wizard's first casting attempt that turn. So, in short, what we need to do is work out what you expect to need to cast, and then ensure you have a little wiggle room in the dice score by taking that extra dice if you need it. There really is never excuse for failing to do this tactic. Now, the second tactic we're going to discuss today in our every magic phase section of this video is drawing out enemy dispel dice. Now, this one is a little more challenging to do consistently. It's not a hard and fast practice every time. And a big part of this tactic is reading your opponent as well. The basic idea is to attempt to cast spells that you don't mind not getting off or not successfully casting. But, at the same time, creating the idea that they might be very important to your game plan. Something that can be very effective in doing this is identifying patterns in your opponent's play. You may find that they always seem to attempt to dispel the first spell you cast, or that they have a favourite unit that they always seem to want to protect. These should form the basis of when to cast those spells that aren't mission critical, if you will. Now, that doesn't mean casting things that will have no value to you. It just means looking at what you could live without, and then trying to use that spell to entice your opponent into a dispel, freeing you up to get critical spells off later. Now, this tactic also applies to dispel scrolls. Drawing them out in the same way can be very helpful. So if we look at, say, a quick example, say we roll 8 power dice, your opponent gets 5 dispel dice. Now, you're very keen on getting off the Law of Light spell, Speed of Light, which is cast on a 10+. Now, you look at playing the odds that we just discussed, and feel confident that your level 4 wizard can do this on 2 dice. The average on 2 dice being 7, you only need a 6, you're already above the average, lovely. So you begin by throwing 4 dice at a banishment on your opponent's key unit or favourite unit, or something that, perhaps really is banishment averse, like Hex Wraiths, or if you've got the Light Council, Frostheart Phoenix. Now, this is a great draw, because if they choose to dispel with 4 dice, they'll only have 1 dice left in their dispel pool. And if they play the odds, they'll likely just want to throw 5 to be sure of a successful dispel. So, boom, they go for the dispel, and you have the space for your crucial spell. If you think they have a scroll, you could choose then to throw, say, 2 dice at another spell to help draw that out before, hitting your Speed of Light. Now, obviously, this is a very specific example, but what it's designed to do is illustrate the principles we're discussing. And if we just touch back on that banishment for a moment, getting that off against something, like we said, like a Frostheart Phoenix, or a unit of Hex Wraiths, that effectively, does huge damage to them. So even if that was your draw out enemy dice spell and they decide to let you have it, or they fail to dispel it, wow, that can still be really great. So the tactics are really simple. It's about trying to get your opponent to spend their dispel dice on spells that are less important to your overall game plan at that moment in time. So we're going to move on. We're going to look at what I call playing with redundancy. Now, this is another one of my classic 20-0 tactics terms, where I'm being a little bit ambiguous. The idea with this one is relatively simple. If you're trying to slow down a particular enemy unit or threat, you want to cast lots of smaller spells at it across the phase. This way, if some of them are dispelled, you still have others to affect the enemy unit's performance. Conversely, if you get your first spell off, this type of tactic allows you to move on to another unit later in the phase as well, so it can be a double win. An example might be, say, casting Melakoth's Mystifying Miasma to lower a unit's weapon skill or initiative, with the plan to then cast Enfeebling Foe to lower their strength, and finally, with the chance to attempt to, say, Wither them as well, to lower their toughness. Now, you'll find that your opponent can't stop all of these, and in fact, you've created lots of redundancy in your casting strategy. That's going to allow you to do something to hurt that unit every turn, because, they're not going to stop them all every turn. Across a game, this will almost certainly lead to units being hit by spells far more regularly than just grabbing 6 dice and throwing a big one, so to speak. So, we're going to move on now to casting order, the 4th tactic in our every magic phase section. Now, many spells you possess will actively improve the effect of other spells in your arsenal. The key to this tactic comes in just taking a moment at the beginning of each of your magic phases. and just having a look at the spells that you have and deciding what order of casting them will lead to the best results. This is even more acute if you have several casters on different laws of magic. For example, if you're using, say, a dark magic spell like Arnispel's Black Horror, can be absolutely devastating. If an enemy fails a strength test, they're removed from play. So good. However, if you also had, say, Word of Pain or a Shadow Wizard in your list with, say, Enfeebling Foe, you could lower your opponent's strength first. So you pick the primary target for your Black Horror, the one you're really desperate to damage, drop their strength with either of those two spells, and suddenly, if you can then Arnispel's Black Horror them as well, wow, they're far less likely to pass that strength test, and you're going to maximise your damage. Now, this will help to maximise your phase every time, and the examples of this really are endless. If anyone's used Law of Life, you'll know you always start with Throne of Vines as it improves the other spells your wizard wants to cast. Well, you can apply that approach to any law of magic and any combinations of laws of magic. So just make sure you take a moment to study the casting order before you start throwing dice. And incidentally, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I've forgotten that one and it's cost me. So really is a crucial tactic. Now, the final tactic we're going to discuss in this section is knowing when to stop. Now, this is not knowing when to show mercy to your opponent. It's about looking and saying, do I really need to cast this spell? If the spell you're looking at casting will likely have no meaningful impact, then don't do it. There are many examples of this. It might be late game and your wizard is short of wounds. A miscast could finish them off, costing you precious victory points. Remember, just because you have power dice doesn't mean you must use them. This is especially acute if you're ahead in a game, and the risk of the miscast could cost you your lead. So, just remember, if a spell is unlikely to yield you a bigger win, you should always consider whether it's really better to just stop instead, consolidate the position you find yourself in. Well, we have powered through that section. So let's do a quick summarise and recap. Remember, always play the odds, and if you're going to attempt to cast something you're statistically unlikely to get off, make sure it's the last spell you cast. There's no excuse for not doing this. Look at what you can do in every phase to draw out enemy dispel dice to get the spells that are most crucial to you off. Play with redundancy to help ensure you hit your main target with something every turn of the game. Don't forget to take a moment to think about your casting order. It's so simple and can be hugely effective. And finally, remember to know when to stop. If it's not going to help you, don't do it. So, we've covered the tactics for any friendly magic phase. And now, we're going to take a look at the second part of this video, and that's based on the tactics you need to build into your army. So here, we're going to cover 4, and they are the spam cast, using items that give you hidden power dice, maximising and interacting with the Law of Death, and maximising bound spells. Okay, so let's begin by discussing the spam cast. Now, certain armies have the ability to take lots of low-level wizards with items, upgrades, or with supporting units that help them to cast. Some examples might be the Beastman with the Shard of the Herdstone, giving you a free power dice for every wizard within 6 inches of it. The Hara Titan and the Casket of Souls for the Tomb Kings with the Light Council. Adding D3 free power dice and adding D3 to every casting attempt for every Nakaran wizard in that army within 12 of the Horror Titan. Or the Mortis Engine and lots of level 1 Necromancers for vampire counts, adding an additional 2 to the casting attempts from the Blasphemous Tome for those wizards. Now, there are others, but maximising spam cast tactics work like this. The idea is that you take several level 1 wizards. They generally all take the signature spell from their lore, as you can guarantee it in every game. So this lets you build around it. And then they throw the minimum number of dice required to successfully cast the spell. Unlike playing the odds from earlier, the idea of spam casting is to actually ride your luck to get lots of the same spell off across a phase. If you fail to cast, it doesn't really matter, as you just move on to the next wizard. broken concentration doesn't mean a lot on level 1. They're only going to cast one spell anyway. Now, if we look at the vampire example, we'd probably have a Master of the Dead on one of the necromancers, and have plenty of zombies to raise above starting size. We throw 1 dice, as we need to just throw a 3+, because 1 or a 2 is always a foul. And, a 3+ will get us a cast of Invocation of the Heck, 3 on the dice, 1 from our wizard level, 2 from the Mortis engine. That gives us the 6 we require. Now, this is powerful because you're going to struggle to stop every one of those spells. Or rather, your opponent is going to struggle to stop every one of those spells. Especially if you're trying to make sure your wizard doesn't lose Dispel concentration themselves. So the last thing they need to do is start throwing 1 dice back, and all of a sudden they're in a whole world of trouble because they failed to Dispel the first or second spell. They're no longer adding their wizard level to the Dispel attempts. So they've got to guarantee it. By doing that, you're using 1 dice to cast. You're already started with more dice than them, and they're having to probably use 2. So this is really quickly going to get out of hand for them. Now, I once played a Beastman player who, using 2 dice for every one of his cast attempts, managed to Wissen's Wild form his Bestigor to strength and toughness 7 with this tactic. So he had 5 level 1 wizards, or they may have been level 2s, I think they were level 1s, Shard of the Herdstone, and again, just a couple of dice, throwing them on, and just riding his luck, basically. Got a bit jammy. That was very Essex of me. Apologies for our not Essex viewers. That got very lucky and rode that up to strength and toughness 7. The unit's a powerhouse. There's nothing you could do about that. Now, it can also make space in the later part of your phase for a higher level wizard to cast a powerful spell as well. So, you throw 1 dice with your first necromancer, same on your second, same on your third, drawing out those Dispel dice, and suddenly you've still got some in your pool. You're well ahead now, and you can get that big spell off with your level 4 necromancer. Maybe he lets everyone make a move with hellish or lets them all reroll their wounds. They go with hellish vigor, or lets them all make a move with Van Houwe's Dance Macabre. So, if you want to play this tactic, remember it's about a good signature spell, and it won't really work if you can't augment the number of power dice available to your army, or the cast values of multiple wizards at the same time. But rest assured, if you can do those things, this can be an incredibly powerful tactic to build into your list. So we're going to move on. We're going to look at using items that offer you hidden power dice. So just to clarify, this one is specifically using items that give you power dice without your opponent knowing you're about to get them. The best example of this, and you'll see me use it a lot on the channel, is the Power Stone. Now this is 1 use only, but it immediately gives the bearer 2 free power dice for the spell they're attempting to cast. Now, they do have to use at least 1 spell from the 1 dice from the pool, but it's still very good. Now, maximising these, if I'm honest, is pretty simple, and it utilises a lot of the every magic phase tactics we discussed earlier in this video. Now, it's critical we don't waste items like this. We can't use them again, they're 1 use. So what we want to do is spend the vast majority of our power dice to draw out the enemy Dispel dice in the phase that we're going to use them in. Now, what you want to leave behind is the minimum that you would need to cast the spell you're looking to get off with the additional dice from your item. So, this goes back to playing the odds and thinking about the order you cast your spells in as well. Now, the last thing to think about is if your opponent hasn't used their Dispel scroll, and you think they've got one, then don't use your hidden power dice item. And from there, really, you should know the drill. You grab the remaining few dice in your pool, you pop your Power Stone, again, other items are available, you see the shock on your opponent's face, and then drop the Spell Bomb. Now, at the right time, in the right space, this can be game-changing, or even game-winning. So it's well worth considering building it into your list. An example that you may see me use on the channel, you'll certainly see me use it on the channel when I bring my competitive Tomb Kings list to the channel, is I'll save a couple of power dice, say 2, with my level 4 Law of Nakara wizard, and then I'll drop my Power Stone to give me 4 power dice, which is statistically enough to just about play the odds. It's statistically enough to cast the can't say it now. Ptah's Incantation of Righteous Smiting. There we go. Got it out in the end, ladies and gentlemen. So it's just enough to cast that, because the average is 14 plus 4 is 18 on the boosted value to give me multiple shots 2 for everyone within 24 or plus 1 attack. But then because I've got my Horror Titan adding D3, actually I should be comfortably inside the odds there. And so I'm turning 2 dice effectively that my opponent was probably thinking, oh, he might go for the bound spell, or he's probably going to go for a low level spell. I'm actually scoring one of the highest cast spells in my lore just by playing this tactic in. So it really can be that powerful, and it really will catch your opponent out if you use it well. So we're going to move on to the third tactic in this section now, and that's maximising and interacting with the Lore of Death. And I'm going to preface this section of the video by saying that this is not a diatribe on the Lore of Death. We all know the Lore of Death is very competitive. We make it a negative comp score at Triple Crown events, and it's very dangerous. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in every element of the tactics of death magic. I mention this because part of what you can do with Lore of Death is to use it as a springboard for a bigger and better magic phase several turns across the game. So, the Lore attribute allows the player to roll a dice for every wound they cause with spells from the Lore of Death. If you're removed from play with a purple sun, it's for every wound you had remaining. And on a roll of a 5+, the controlling player gains a power dice. Now, this can mean that with one big spell, you can get sort of 8, 10, 12 back if you get a really good rollout. And it's almost like having a second magic phase. Now, we mention it here because of this. We're not really talking about the spell specifically, we're talking about the attribute's power. So to maximise the Lore of Death, obviously you're going to want a mobile caster that can get into the best positions to ensure they can generate the dice for you in the first place. But then what you're also going to want, I think, is to have other wizards on different laws of magic, if you like, as support casters to your Death Wizard. Now, that might be a second level 4, it might be 2 or 3 level 2s, but the idea is that they can use the dice that you generate from your lore attribute on the Lore of Death to cast buffs or other spells that will help you to win the game. So when I talk about maximising interactions with Lore of Death, this is what I mean. So what I'm saying is, if you're thinking strongly about Lore of Death in your army, I'd recommend having other support casters to utilise the dice that this lore will generate for you. And this will ensure you're getting the most out of Lore of Death, and it will ensure you get the most out of the magic phases. Furthermore, the Death Mage is often really great for drawing Dispel dice. People really fear the spells from this lore, and this will also mean that your other wizards can get spells off as a result. I've lost count of the times with my Wood Elves I've gone for a Dark Magic spell as my first spell, and my opponents let me have it because they're so concerned that I'm going to drop a really horrible death spell with my second level 4. And actually, I wasn't planning on doing that at all. It was just part of that drawing Dispel dice game that we talked about earlier. Wow, we're on to the final tactic in this section already. Can't believe we've got there. So, we are maximising bound spells, and that's what we're going to discuss now. Now, obviously, this one's one you have to build into your list. You've got to purchase the items or the bound spells to use it. Now, there are 3 ways that I'd recommend maximising using bound spells. So, the first of these is to use the bound spell as the final spell of your turn. So, bound spells usually require very few dice to cast. They're normally quite low values. Saving 1 or 2 dice at the end of your turn will usually mean you can get that juicy bound spell off, especially if it's hidden. You've got an item like, say, the Book of Arcan or the Ruby Ring. If you've not used it yet, your opponent doesn't know you've got it. Now, this works well because in most phases, your opponent will have used their Dispel dice on your earlier spells, especially if you're only leaving a couple of dice at the end of your phase, and especially if you've gone for some of your big powerful hitters earlier on in your magic phase. Now, obviously, this is not hard and fast rule, but saving odd dice will likely mean that your opponent won't have the ability to dispel your bound spell. Plus, as you don't add wizard levels to bound spells, and they are quite easy to dispel, waiting until your opponent has no dice is a pretty solid use for them. So that's one way you can use your bound spells to maximise your casting phase or to maximise their use. Now, the second way of using them is kind of the polar opposite, and that's to build them into your list as a dice draw. So that's to say you take those bound spells in your list like Ruby Ring or, you know, perhaps Book of Arcane, and actually you're a little less interested in successfully casting them because you know that they're you're not adding wizard levels, and so they're quite easy to dispel. So you actually go for them early on in the magic phase. You throw a couple of dice at them in an attempt to get your opponent to spend their dispel dice stopping them. Now, this can be really good because it keeps all of your wizard spells available rather than using one of them as a dice draw. So it's also kind of allows you to ensure that your opponent's not totally sure what you might attempt to cast next, because when you've got 4 or 5 spells still available, you know, what you're going to do next is hard to predict. When you've only got 1 or 2, it's easier to predict. So by using the bound spell as the dice draw, if you like, as the spell to draw enemy dispel dice out, you're effectively giving yourself the best chance to maximise your wizard's other spells. So it's a bit of a different tactic, but it can work just as effectively. Now, the final way that we can maximise our bound spells, or use bound spells to maximise our magic phase, our casting phase rather, is actually designed for use with innate bound spells. Well, you can use it with a normal bound spell, but it's far better to use this with an innate bound spell. And if I'm honest, this is probably the least tactical thing we're going to talk about today. It's more of a reminder of something you can do with innate bound spells. Now, when you cast a bound spell with Irresistible Force, its power is exhausted, and you cannot cast it again in this game. However, with innate bound spells, this doesn't happen. They never run out of power. So casting them with Irresistible Force doesn't actually carry any negative effects. So, with that in mind, with innate bound spells, it can be worth considering throwing 5 or 6 dice at them, as you're not really worried about the double 6, and the big cast value you can generate by throwing that many dice will mean your opponent either has to throw a lot of dispel dice, or just let the spell go. Now, when you look at the quality of many of Warhammer's innate bound spells, the Casket of Souls, for example, the Banishment from the War Altar, they're really great, powerful spells. So, you know, you definitely want to get them off. You know, this tactic is well worth considering. Even if we're being honest, it might feel a little distasteful. Well, that about wraps up our section on tactics you need to build into your list. As we can see, these can be very powerful, but are exceptionally specific, and so you won't use these as often as you would use the tactics we discussed in the Every Magic Phase section of this video. In conclusion, there are many tactical nuances you can employ when casting spells in Warhammer. Consistently applying these tactics will help to ensure your magic phases are more reliable and have a greater impact on your games of 8th edition. So, we've reached the end of today's 20-0 tactics video. I hope it's given you some food for thought when harnessing the winds of magic. As ever, feel free to get in touch through all of our social media platforms to let us know your thoughts, and head back to the Knight of the Realm mustering ground to check out the rest of our content. Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share today. What are you doing, mate?
I'm sharing.
It's not that sort of sharing, mate.
Oh. Head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.